There's very few works of narrative art that feel as ambitious to me as Osamu Tezuka's Phoenix. The first volume is a drama set in the early period of human civilization. The second takes place at the very end of human civilization, millions of years in the future, and then each corresponding volume alternates backwards and forwards in time, each story linked by the reincarnation of characters across history, as well as the mythical, eternal life-giving bird that gives the manga its title. Running from 1967 until his death in 1989, it's no wonder Osamu Tezuka considered this his life's work. And in fact, he would sometimes joke that he planned to write the final volume as a single panel on his deathbed, though sadly this did not come to pass. Something that ambitious kind of shouldn't be good, and yet here we are. It might be my favourite comic of all time. It's both pulpy and existential, funny and sad, and visually dynamic in a way that is pure comics. It feels like what would happen if Karl Barks, Akira Kurosawa, and Ursula K. Le Guin all accidentally got into that teleporter from The Fly at the same time. It's something too pure for this world. But despite my love of the manga, I find that very few of the adaptations really work. In some ways, I guess that isn't surprising, because so many of the things that make Phoenix interesting have to do with how it uses the medium of comics. There are so many experimental panel and page layouts, and they are a pretty inextricable part of how the story is told. So it's very, very hard to adapt, because if you just depict the raw events, you're missing half of what makes the story work. Large parts of Phoenix are pretty heady. There's a kind of William Blake-esque quality to its mysticism, Tezuka attempting to explain his own spin on Buddhist cosmology and reincarnation. And there are plenty of grim events here. We see the end of humanity and the death of several alien civilizations. We see suffering across aeons, characters finding enlightenment in one reincarnation, and then bringing about suffering and bad karma in the next. But importantly, Phoenix isn't just dire. There is also screwball comedy in here, and comedic or just plain strange asides. Which I think is important because, you know, silly stuff and humor is as much a part of the human condition as anything else. Most readers, though, tend to say that they're put off by the comedy, by the sudden shifts into screwball hijinks, and so this is usually the first thing an adaptation will cut. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, though, because the first anime adaptation doesn't really have these problems specifically. Phoenix 2772 was released in 1980 and is very much Tezuka's brainchild. Years earlier, there had been plans to produce a sequel to the live-action adaptation of the manga, but because it was adapting Volume 2, which takes place entirely in a future dystopia, it was decided that the sequel would be animated rather than live-action. However, the first film underperformed, so the ideas that were left over from that sequel were incorporated into this film. This isn't a straight-up adaptation of Volume 2 at all, though. Rather, it takes elements from all of the sci-fi chapters of Phoenix that had been released up to that point, and uses them to tell an original story. There's a lot to admire in this film, and I think of all the adaptations, it probably captures that free-flowing experimentalism of the manga best. It opens with this live-action model of a baby in a test tube, very, very evocative of 2001: A Space Odyssey of the Star Child. And I would say that Kubrick's adaptation of Arthur C. Clarke's novel hangs over basically every adaptation of Phoenix as a major reference point, which is kind of funny because Phoenix actually predates 2001 by a year, or if you take into account the kind of aborted early chapters of Phoenix, it predates it by decades. However, there is a pretty big 2001 Tezuka connection. Tezuka famously claimed that he was contacted by Kubrick to work on 2001's design after the director saw Astro Boy, an offer he had to turn down because of his numerous projects. Even without this connection, I get the impression that Tezuka felt a kinship with the film because it's trying to do a very similar thing to Phoenix. They're both stories that trace human civilization over millennia, and they both involve themes of transcendence through interactions with these strange alien creatures, you know, the monolith in 2001 and the Phoenix in Phoenix. It must have been really, really difficult for Tezuka to turn down that offer, and I get the impression that this Phoenix movie is sort of his attempt to do his version of that film. For instance, the first 20 minutes of the film are silent, aside from a classical music score. In them, we watch the main character Godo being raised by AI, with only his robot companion Olga for company. Beautiful Tezuka stuff happening with this robot, by the way, but very reminiscent of the Tezuka comics they found in his in his drawer many years after he died. Once the characters start talking, though, the other major influence comes into view, which is Disney. Disney was, of course, one of Tezuka's major influences, and I can imagine him pitching this as a kind of sci-fi version of Fantasia, though I think in his hands it feels less Night on Bald Mountain and more Worker and Parasite.
Do you like music? It'll make you feel much better. Believe me, it really works. Right then, we're all ready. Let's begin. Can't stand it.
This is sort of where the film falls apart for me, basically once people start talking, but there are these little alien and robot sidekicks, and we're treated to these dance number musical sequences things.
They're kissing. Oh, I don't think it's such an insanitary habit. On the planet where I come from, nobody does any kissing. We treat people with respect. Even everybody kisses here.
But they are just so interminable. I just can't really picture anyone finding these enjoyable. So there is much that I admire about this film. There's lots of formal experimentation happening here. The camera is constantly doing these really impressive dynamic movements. Dialogue often kind of cuts out for these purely kinetic scenes that remind me a lot of silent cinema. And the backgrounds and environments are very original. There's an original look to this film. It doesn't really appear like other anime from the period. If anything, it reminds me more of French animation, like the stuff René Laloux was doing at the time, for instance. It's sort of Fantastic Planet-esque. And I really like how the Phoenix itself is presented in this film. In the manga, the Phoenix is just this totally unserious cosmic bird. She just looks like she's trolling people all the time. She's got this kind of goofy smile. But here, she's presented more as this sort of shape-shifting being. She's like a mass of energy in the shape of a bird, more than the literal cutesy bird creature we see in the manga. And I think that works pretty well. But this is, for me, mostly a failed experiment. In the manga, the panel layouts and page designs draw us closer to the characters and their internal subjectivity, whereas a lot of the experimental aspects of this film have the opposite effect. They draw me out of the experience. They make me more distanced from the plot because we have to do yet another dance sequence before the narrative can start moving again. And I just gotta say, these dance sequences, they just are interminable. So there's much to respect here, but it's more of an oddity than something I genuinely enjoy watching. Oh, one little side note, though. This movie ends with the world exploding and a man and a woman despairing on a beach. So maybe yet another influence on End of Evangelion? Another part of End of Ava's influence soup? From 1986 to 1987, Madhouse released 3 Phoenix anime. Each adapts a different volume of the manga, and each is by a different director. The first being Rintaro, the second Kawajiri, and the third Harada. This is a really good idea, I think, allowing different creators to interpret segments in different ways. And these are definitely interpretations, each with different styles, character designers, and vibes. Rintaro's is a religious epic. Kawajiri's is this very 1980s alien-esque working-class sci-fi, and Toshio Harada's is more of a fable. For a lot of people, the film by Rintaro, Phoenix Karma, is the best Phoenix adaptation bar none. I remember first encountering it through one of Justin Sudeikis' old Buried Treasure columns, where he described it as a, quote, work of stunning beauty and unmitigated brilliance, and an experience that will stay with you for days. And there is a lot to love in this movie. A very powerful plot line, which is a meditation on morality and change and art, a evocative synth soundtrack, and images which feel stark and impressive. And it's adapting one of the best, maybe the best volume of Phoenix, which charts the twin destinies of a Buddhist sculptor and a one-armed bandit. But I have to say, I don't think I have ever quite gotten along with this film as well as other people have. I think part of it for me is in its style. The volume it's adapting is so impressive and playful and strange in its use of paneling, much of which it's using to get us inside the mind of these artists, these sculptors. There are 2 moments in the manga where the once cruel bandit Gao reaches an experience of transcendence through art, and both are just complete tour de forces in Tezuka's career. They are moments that just blew me away, some of the best moments I've experienced in comics. And they rely on a lot of aesthetic fragmentation and kind of surrealism and just a lot of really smart design work. The style of Rintaro's film, it's more like a David Lean epic. It's sort of stately and composed, and it takes itself very seriously, but it just doesn't quite capture that sense of fragmentation that I love so much in the original. It feels honestly a little bit too removed to me, a little bit sterile. As far as Tezuka adaptations go, I think Rintaro's Metropolis, which also takes some influence from Phoenix, is a lot more successful. Still, I want to be clear, it is really good. This is a really good movie, and actually Rintaro's version of that scene of transcendence I mentioned, while less interior than the manga, is still very cool in its own right. It's really a matter of taste. For some, this segment will hit much better than it did for me. Being such a fan of the manga, it doesn't really translate what I like about that story particularly well into film. And then there's Kawajiri's adaptation of Volume 4 of the manga. This one is pretty good, I would say. It's kind of fun to see one of the science fiction volumes of Phoenix being adapted in this very 1980s sci-fi anime style. I mentioned before that Kubrick hangs over a lot of these adaptations. This has a lot of 2001 in it, for sure. There's a lot of Kubrick here. I also think there's a lot of Tarkovsky happening here. This feels very Solaris at times, with the way the alien planet is presented and with the sort of isolation in the plotline. The narrative kind of converges on this moment where a character is cursed by the Phoenix for his actions. And I think that moment is one of the better scenes of cosmic horror I've seen in a film. It really captures that sense of someone's reality suddenly violently shifting. It's one of the few moments where the Phoenix is genuinely scary. And I think that kind of cosmic horror is very, very hard to adapt into film. So I found that very impressive.
お前の顔は永遠に醜く、罪の刻印として子々孫々まで受け継がれていくのです。そしてお前の子孫は永遠に宇宙をさまい、満たされない旅を続ける定めを持つでしょう。やめろ、やめてくれ。
Toshio Harada's segment is by far the least discussed, which I suppose partly owes to Harada himself being the most obscure of these directors. I found a Japanese interview where The writer noted that whereas Rintaro's segment had the most showy elements and Kawajiri's was the most hard-boiled, Harada's was the most straight ahead in its vision, which kind of feels like damning with faint praise to me. However, I would actually say that this one is probably my favourite of the 3 late 80s adaptations. I like it quite a bit. For one, it just looks absolutely beautiful with these gorgeous watercolour backgrounds. But I think what I appreciate about it the most is it feels the least rushed. Both of the previous segments to me felt like they didn't quite have enough time for the material they were dealing with. But this plotline, which involves a Yamato prince sent to fight against a tribe but falling in love with its princess, fits perfectly into the hour-long format. Beyond that, I think Harada is the only one of these directors who captures, in his own way, that playful, formal inventiveness that powers the comic. It's not goofy like Tezuka's can be, but there is this expressive joy to the visuals. Like, just look at the way fire is used in this work. The strands of light during this dance, the scope given by orbs of light from an army of soldiers on horseback, or this really grandiose moment where the phoenix creates a towering wall of flame. This imagery feels somehow primordial to me. It really gives me goosebumps. Like in Rintaro's segment, there is a moment here where the main character is granted a shard of enlightenment from the phoenix. And the way Harada portrays that reminded me quite a bit of the big scene many years later in Paul Schrader's First Reformed. All of the formal play here is in service to the central relationship, though, which I found genuinely affecting. Harada is kind of a sneaky wee auteur. Like, people love his OVA Bobby's Girl, for instance, but I think because he's primarily worked in children's animation, he's been somewhat ignored in anime fandom. Seems like a shame, because this segment for me is basically a 10 out of 10 perfect anime. Very, very good stuff, and just really underrated. Still, the only TV series adaptation of Phoenix is the one from 2004, produced by Tezuka Pro and airing on NHK. And this is the anime that has still adapted by far the most of the manga. It adapts 5 different of the stories. And it's pretty straight ahead with very manga accurate scripts and designs. But unfortunately, I can only really say this TV show is okay at best, and if I'm being real, I think the whole thing makes me feel a little bit sad. The biggest issue of the 2004 Phoenix is just how rushed it is. My favourite volume of the manga is the second one, Future, the furthest in the timeline, and technically this adaptation ends with a 2-episode version of that story, but it really encapsulates all the problems with this adaptation. It's so rushed to the degree that I kind of don't understand why they bothered adapting it in the first place. Massive chunks of the story are removed, and not like inconsequential chunks, like really important parts to the story are just taken out, and then there'll be like a line of exposition to explain that aspect. Volume 2 is such a cosmic and ambitious piece in the manga, but here it kind of feels like a mid-budget episode of Doctor Who. Lots of people running through generic sci-fi corridors and expositing situations that we don't get to see. It's just very disappointing, and I'm sad that this is the only adaptation we have of a volume I really love. Not all the adaptations are this bad in the TV series, but none of them feel like they have as much visual ingenuity as I would like. It's also a bummer because the staff here is really good. It's directed by Ryosuke Takahashi, someone I have a major soft spot for, the director of Votoms and Dogram and Gasaraki, and the character designs are by Akio Sugino, who did an amazing job doing the designs for the excellent 90s Blackjack OVA. But it seems as if everyone is basically on autopilot here. I had problems with some of the adaptational choices in prior Phoenix anime, but you know, those were at least choices. This show just feels lifeless, very methodical. The only real choices seem to have been how many scenes can we shave down to tell this story as quickly as possible. And finally, I think a lot of people might be surprised to hear that there was a Phoenix adaptation that aired in 2023, Phoenix Eden 17. This thing was buried on Disney+, and like a lot of anime that comes out on that platform, it didn't really get a lot of fandom discussion. It's a 4-episode OVA by Studio 4C, directed by Shojiro Nishimi. Studio 4C is a natural fit for Phoenix, I would say. Their style is similarly dreamy and experimental, and it was apparently a passion project for the studio. In an interview with the Japanese site Get News, producer Eiko Tanaka said the project was in development for 7 years. I'm sure a lot of those 7 years was just spent figuring out how do we fund this thing, but still, it shows how badly they wanted to make it. Eden 17 also gets a lot of points for choosing an arc of Phoenix that had never been adapted before, Nostalgia. This is a particularly respected volumes, one of the sci-fi stories, with a very, very ambitious narrative. It takes place over thousands of years and involves the fate of 2 different planetary civilizations. And there's a lot to like here. Tatsuzo Nishida's character designs are wispy and ethereal and very pleasant. The score is very atmospheric, and there is some really beautiful environmental design, some really nice sci-fi backgrounds going on in this. And it does about as good a job as it could, I think, in adapting a volume which, even by Phoenix standards, is pretty out there and pretty tough to adapt. I can appreciate too that this is a work by sickos for sickos. Nostalgia is a volume that was always designed to sort of link up various parts of the future era we see in Phoenix. And they do that even more here, making sure to have the futuristic Earth city the plot eventually reaches resemble a proto-version of the city we see in Volume 2 of the manga at the end of human history. They absolutely did not have to do that. I would be surprised if that's something more than a dozen people noticed. But they did. They did it for sickos like me, and that absolutely rules. And there are actually lots of attempts here to match the experimental style of the manga. One shot I particularly liked is used to illustrate thousands of years of cultural denigration towards war, and it does so very elegantly. A character throws a Molotov cocktail, which in its flight becomes a missile, then a jet plane, and then a nuclear warhead. That's a really great way to get that idea across, and it feels very, very Phoenix. Overall, though, while I'm mostly positive on this adaptation, I think it is one of the better anime adaptations of Phoenix. I do have to report that watching it just kind of feels like a bummer. I don't know. I mean, the story it's adapting is inherently kind of a bummer. It's a tragedy. But reading the manga, it never feels that way to me. I don't know if that's just because of the pacing or the occasional weird slapstick comedy. But again, I return to this problem. Reading the manga of this story was intriguing and page-turning and exciting, but watching the anime as it culminated in its twin strands of apocalypse, I just kind of went, damn, bummer. But that is not all. That is not all, because there is in fact also one more adaptation to talk about, and that is the live-action adaptation of Phoenix, released in 1978, adapting the first volume of the manga. This thing is extremely underseen, so much so that the Wikipedia article mentions how difficult it is to find. On that note, I'll just say, wow, I sure do love archive.org. Archive.org is such a cool website. Wow, archive.org. The first thing I want to mention about this production is just how insanely stacked the cast is. We have some of the all-time greats of Japanese cinema here. We have the recently departed Tatsuya Nakadai, one of the most beautiful men who has ever lived, plays the villain. You may recognize Nakadai from a whole bunch of late-period Kurosawa films, or from the 9-hour anti-war epic The Human Condition. As always, no one else can do as much eye acting as this man can. Kaoru Yumi gives an extremely charming performance as Uzume, the dancer who uses makeup to disguise her beauty. And 10 years after Funeral Parade of Roses, we have the incredibly hot Peter playing one of the members of Himiko's court, oozing charisma as always. And very cool here that nothing is made of her being trans. She is just a member of the court. Gosh, she's insanely hot. And that's not all. This is directed by Kon Ichikawa, one of the greats of the Japanese studio system, the director of The Burmese Harp and An Actor's Revenge. And you might wonder, how does a classical Japanese director, a guy who came up in the 1950s, deal with adapting manga, this relatively new, visually vibrant medium. Is his heart in it? Does it feel stately and detached? Folks, his heart is absolutely in it. He understands the assignment completely here. Across this 2.5-hour epic, he uses a frenetic display of cinematic techniques to capture Tezuka's tone. It feels like a mix between a Kurosawa samurai film and like a Godardian Truffaut French New Wave film. It's like a mix between a New Wave film and a samurai epic. We've got match cuts, we have jump cuts, we have manga-like split screens, and we even have animation. The Phoenix here is mostly this adorably goofy looking felt puppet with a lot of lens flare over it, but at other times it's animated, and an animation in this film is used usually to present someone's sort of inner state, like anger, or this sequence where one character explains his plan to use flaming haystacks as projectiles. Other times it's used for these sudden and jarring gags, but primarily it's a method of articulating the character's inner state to the viewer. And I love it. I think it's really fun. To be honest, I'm kind of simplifying things by presenting director Ichikawa as simply an old guard director reacting to manga, because Ichikawa actually got his start in animation, and his films were always highly visual, always playing with the mix of reality and artifice. He mentioned several times that he had longed to adapt this volume for years and years, and it was just clearly a labor of love for him. In fact, check out this amazing picture of Ichikawa and Tezuka at the premiere with a big phoenix ice sculpture behind them. Ichikawa looks so psyched. This was a kind of event film. A lot of talent was gathered here. The screenplay was by Shuntaro Tanikawa, one of the most acclaimed Japanese poets of the 21st century, and the score, which is gorgeous, is by Michael Legrand, a French composer mainly known for his work on Jacques Demy films. And so there was just a lot of stuff going on here, and there is a certain messy maximalist soup-like quality of this film, a piece almost collapsing under the weight of everything it's trying to show off to you. And I know a lot of people will find this aesthetic maximalism I'm describing kind of off-putting, which is fair enough, but I love it. Kon Ichikawa, I think, is basically the only director in live action or animation who has captured what reading a Tezuka manga feels like. Now, lots of creators have taken his stories and characters and translated them into their own styles. Many have done so very successfully. I mean, I adore Rintaro's Metropolis, I love Osamu Tezuka's Blackjack, but Ichikawa captures that initial raw feeling of Tezuka, that singular mix of Shakespearean drama and cosmic scope and Looney Tunes hijinks, and he managed to do it in live action, no less. It should not work, but I think it really does. And I want to make it very clear, this isn't all slapstick, it's not all cartoony. When Ichikawa needs to build suspense, he absolutely does. Like most Phoenix stories, this has a very bloody ending. Most of the characters we grow to love are not going to make it out of this alive. And when the violence hits, it's as powerful as it needs to be. And I want to emphasize too that we have beautiful photography in this movie of the Japanese countryside. Images that feel primordial, human figures within impossibly large landscapes, and populated by actors who are used to playing characters in these sorts of Jidaigeki epics. So when things are serious, it feels grave and elemental. At the heart of the film is the relationship between Sarutahiko and a young boy from a tribe he murdered, Nagi. Tomisaburo Wakayama portrays a similar protector father figure in Lone Wolf and Cub, but here he has to do much of the same work with a giant prosthetic nose, and somehow he absolutely makes it work. It's a very sweet and compelling dynamic. Parallel to this, we have this sort of existential Beckett play that forms. This narrative of two people stuck in a deep dark hole with food only in the form of moss and moisture, but no way out. I would never dare to spoil where this parallel plotline goes, except to say that it leads to an ending that I find hilarious, and which functions as a kind of thesis statement for the manga as a whole. It should be clear by now that I adore this film. It is in fact maybe one of my favourite films of all time, for its mix of humanist emotion and completely maximalist style. I will say though that this movie is probably the definition of Marmite, but if any of this does sound like something you could enjoy, please try to give it a shot. The cinema is a hungry beast. It yearns to feed on new images, and Phoenix has those in spades. Anyway, that's it. It's been fun. No more Phoenix adaptations. None left. They're all gone. They're all gone. There's no more.
I call it the Cloud Atlas Sextet. There are whole movements I wrote imagining us meeting again and again in different lives, different ages.
What are you doing in here?
We cross and recross our old tracks like figure skaters. The love of my life, what had happened to her?
Okay, Cloud Atlas may not literally be an adaptation of Phoenix, but come on. We've got a story across millennia with interweaving segments linked by the reincarnation of characters across epochs, with historical drama and science fiction echoing each other, as well as some occasionally concerning caricatures that we all wish weren't in it. It's Phoenix! Cloud Atlas is Phoenix. It's another adaptation of Phoenix, folks. Come on. And at first I was like, there's no way British author David Mitchell knows who Osamu Tezuka is. That's not possible. Not realizing he's actually married to a Japanese woman. He translates Japanese works on autism, and he's lived in Japan for many years. So, maybe. To be clear, I do doubt the similarities are more than coincidental, but I will also say that the film's co-directed by noted weebs, the Wachowski sisters. Did you know, by the way, that Mitchell also co-wrote The Matrix Resurrections? Very glad to know there's at least one boomer British writer who hasn't descended into brainworm turf barbarism. Anyway, aside from the big concerning caricature elephant in the room, Cloud Atlas mostly kind of rules. This movie slaps. A lot of big character actor performances. We get to see Hugh Grant as a cannibal. It's a good time. I always tear up at the ending monologue. What can I say? I like maximalist stories with a lot of big aesthetic ideas and a fixation on mortality. Alright, it is now really the end of the video. Stay safe out there, folks. Try not to get lost in the binds of samsara. Read Phoenix. Tell me what you think of the part where slugs become the dominant species after a global nuclear war.